So, Lutherans, reason, and apologetics. If you ask a Lutheran what what the Lutheran attitude is towards reason, and tasks that involve a use of reason and weighing of evidence and so on, they'll typically, they'll typically say something like, well, I cannot by my own reason or strength believe in the Lord Jesus Christ.
Or come to him.
Or come.
Right.
If they know a little bit more about Luther, they might say, reason is the devil's whore. Whoa! There you go. Which Luther did say. Or Frau Hulda, or etc. And Luther said those things are, the Small Catechism explains the third article of the Creed that way, to be sure. There's another side of the story. You can see it somewhere back there. In the first article of the Creed, Luther also says, I believe that God has given me my reason and senses, and still, and we might add, though they're fallen, preserves them. He can say, so that would be a confessional thing. Luther can say things like, well, reason is the devil's whore, or Frau Hulda, or what have you. He can also say things that God's greatest gift to human beings was reason. The thing that separates human beings from animals is reason, and so on. The issue for the Lutheran is not reason. That's a smokescreen. That's the issue for Luther, and I would say any Christian and reason, is how do you use reason? And a distinction is usually made, and it's a very helpful distinction between when Luther and Lutherans are looking askew at reason. It's always when reason is used in what's called a magisterial way, as if reason is the final standard such that it's over revelation. So, for example, the texts in all four Gospels in 1 Corinthians has Jesus' words, this is my body, this is my blood. So we say, well, it's his body, it's his blood, though it's bread and wine. Reason used magisterial would say that makes no sense. How can the infinite become the finite, or something like that? So for Lutherans, we're always careful, and historically have always been careful, because it can, misuse of reason, or a reason that's untethered and excuse me, not subject to God's revelation, can run amok. So we've always described our view of reason as a great gift and tool from God, so long as it's used in a ministerial sense, a way that serves the gospel and submits to God's revelation. And to be frank, I kind of think it's the most reasonable position to say, if God, and it's not a hypothetical question for me, but if God has in fact revealed himself in time and space, wouldn't it be reasonable for a creature who has like a very small perspective and experience with the world to submit to like the eternal God who's revealed himself in time and space? So the distinctions are helpful, worth maintaining. What is not helpful is Lutherans maintaining this sort of suspicion always and everywhere, such that it affects their attitude towards apologetics and natural law, such that they dismiss such endeavors, because Luther was against reason, so therefore we must be against it. Now, nobody's published an opinion like that, but if you could, if you spend much time in our circles talking about apologetics or something like that, you're going to have some people say, well, we don't do that. Or let it's the Reformed or the evangelicals who do that, or the Catholics talk about natural law. That's just not something we do. That's total hogwash. It's a very parochial understanding of the Lutheran tradition when it comes to those things. There's a long history of it from Luther to the present day. In our context, the leading lights in all this were people like, you perhaps heard some of these names. I mentioned Rob Rosenblatt earlier. He's died last year. Well, it was this year, but early in the year. He was sort of like the apologist par excellence in the United States, in the LCMS world anyway. And his teacher, a guy who's still living, I think because God's scared of him going to heaven. John Warwick Montgomery, otherwise known by his friends as John Warlike Montgomery, who's now, he might be 93 now, but seems to be fading a little bit. But for decades, those guys led the way in not just defending the Christian faith in whatever arena, but also articulating, if you will, a Lutheran vision for apologetics. An apologetic that was especially interested in using reason and evidence in service of finding ways to present the crucified and risen Christ to the person that you're speaking with, without getting distracted by all the sort of cultural stuff and philosophical stuff. That's the thing that Lutherans bring to the table. If you're interested, there's an old essay in the Modern Reformation magazine that I'm pretty sure I haven't looked in the last 6 months, but probably is still available via Google if you look far enough, called The Incarnate Christ. The subtitle is The Apologetic Thrust of Lutheran Theology. And what it does is John Warwick Montgomery arguing that lots of Christian traditions do apologetics of one sort or another. Catholics especially are really good at natural law reasoning and defending the naturalness of heterosexual marriage, or however we want to call it these days. They're really good at natural law reasoning and advocating for a pro-life position and so on. Evangelicals, like the people down at Biola, the good people down at Biola, William Lane Craig, are really good at arguing very persuasively from philosophy and science for the reasonableness and believing God exists. There's lots of apologetics being done. Where Lutherans should or can or ought to find themselves in that the apologetic zoo, because it is kind of a zoo sometimes, is in making a case, a historical case, that not just that Jesus was a real historical person, but his crucifixion and even his resurrection are real historical events demonstrated by the evidence. That's when you look historically at Lutherans who have done apologetics, that's where they typically focus their efforts for good reason. Because for Lutherans, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but for Lutherans, our approach to theology and worldview is not sort of a top-down deductive thing. And this is another thing that's kind of unique for Lutherans is we don't assume a worldview picture of everything and then go to the Bible and start dumping data in support of all those particular things. Or at least, hopefully we don't. That's not the historic practice of doing theology or doctrine in the Lutheran tradition. The Lutherans typically work a way that's, this is not a criticism of the Reformed world or Calvinism, but Calvinists, Reformed Christians, typically in their apologetics seem to, more often than not, suggest that one can know Christianity is true by its internal coherence. Like if you look at the whole Christian worldview, it all fits perfectly the way they articulate it. And because it is free of logical contradiction or paradox, it must be true. Lutherans say, well, that's all nice, but a guy like Francisco would say, I can articulate Islam in a way that's very coherent. Does that make it true? Or I don't know a whole lot about Scientology, but I bet you could articulate it in a way that's internally coherent. That doesn't mark its truthfulness. Lutherans work from the ground up. As Luther put it once, he says, if you want to know about the creator of the heavens and earth, the way to know about the creators of the heavens and earth is not to engage in metaphysical speculation, but rather to look at the lap of Mother Mary and see the God and creator of all things on her lap. He gets into eating, drink, nursing, thank you, nursing from I didn't want to say things that made me embarrassed and turn me red, but
Chest feed?
yes.
Yes,
Look at the lap of that chest feeding person. So that's what, and so what that means is, for when it comes to it seems that theologically, not just seems, it is the case that theologically Lutherans have a whole lot to do and offer in the realm of apologetics, and a witness to the Christian faith that works The technical term would be inductively or abductively. That works from little pieces of evidence to a persuasive way rather than a top-down, here's our ideology, and look at it, how coherent it is, therefore it's true, but rather, hey, look, this, that, and the other thing, it means that, or don't you think it means that, or something along those lines. That is to say, Lutherans especially should, that doesn't mean they always do, can avoid the trap of ideology. One way to some describe a world as it's filled with all sorts of ideologies. That is, these pictures of the world or reality that are pretty comprehensive and purport to describe things as they actually are, and that are taken merely on faith and are then politicized. So the way this is done in Christian circles is to say Christianity is true regardless of the facts. Or the way, and this is not necessarily, I don't want to pick on the man, but I'm going to mention the name, Ken Ham, Advances in Genesis. Some of you maybe saw the debate he had with Bill Nye, the alleged science guy, over creation, and God exists. Well, it was over creation, but God's existence was the implication. At the end of that debate, the moderator, that name escapes me, asked both of them. This is on national TV. You both are very, said something like, you both are very committed in your position. Is there anything that would get you to change your mind? And ideologues would say, when people ask them about, well, why do you think this is true, and is there anything that would cause you to change your mind? And an ideologue would say, nothing would change my mind. And that's how Ken Ham answered the question. Nothing would change my mind. I'm going to maintain this position regardless of the facts, is effectively what he was saying. Now, I know what Ken Ham was doing there. You know, he's playing to the Christian crowd, in particular the fundamentalist crowd that pay millions or give millions of dollars to Answers in Genesis. Answers in Genesis can do some good stuff, but they also tend towards this fundamentalism that is very ideological. It was, interestingly, Bill Nye who answered the way that I think Christians ought to respond, and Lutherans certainly could respond. Yeah, I'd change my mind if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. That's not to say that that's like a big question, and I don't know how you verify, like if someone found some bones and some DNA in bones or something, but hypothetically speaking, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, Christianity is false. 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says it in several different ways. If he did not rise from the dead, we're the most pitiable of all creatures, because we're still dead in our trespasses and sins. We believed a lie. The Christian faith, borrowing from 2 Peter, is at best a cleverly devised myth. That means Christianity's truthfulness is contingent, dependent on certain facts. It's not an ideology, like a system of ideas that just sort of floats abstract from the world of reality and evidence and facts and so on, and that is true just because it's coherent, but it's dependent on certain things. And if there is a theology, I know there's others that do it, and this is not, well, it kind of is. Advancing Lutherans as being distinct and better than everybody else, but
that's true.
But if there is a theology that focuses not to a fault, but focuses intently on the incarnation of God in Christ, it would be. I mean, it's the Lutheran tradition that's known for that, and so there is plenty of space from a Lutheran theological position or confession for Christian apologetics. That, and there's that small matter we talked about earlier, that the scriptures themselves exhort all Christians to be engaged or be prepared, always be prepared for the endeavor. And when it comes to natural law or / natural theology, Paul writes in Romans chapter 1 and 2 that even the pagans have the law of God written on their heart. They demonstrate it by trying to do what is good. The psalmist says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. That must mean that it's wise / reasonable to believe God exists. In fact, the heavens declare his glory, the sky his handiwork, and so on and so forth. some resources. There's lots more.
Comment?
No.
Nice.
Yes, sir.
I think Lutherans struggle, you mentioned it a little bit earlier. Luther actually said, faith must deny reason. And Lutherans have a difficult time putting that reason back into their faith.
Yeah.
Why do you have, you're Lutheran, why is that, Rick?
Why am I Lutheran? This could take days. It's easy.
No, but answering your own question or your comment. Can you answer your own comment?
Quickly, why am I a Lutheran? I'm a Lutheran. I'm a believer in the Bible. I believe Jesus Christ died for me. My life, again, everything in my life is pointing me that direction. I'm one of those guys that, I'm a Cal grad. I tried different things. I went the other direction. God kept yanking me back. My wife just died. I still have faith. Where's that come from? Not me. That's not me. If I can't believe for me is something bigger that's taking care of me, I don't have reason or faith. I'm lost.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry about that.
Thank you.
To put it like an academic way, is the scriptures teach this, and the Lutheran tradition confesses those teachings. So it
Works.
In terms of the reason, one thing that's funny with the whole discussion about faith and reason is like when people say, well, reason says this, so how can you believe that? I'm like, what is reason anyway? Just what the heck is it? It's not like a substance. It's a method. It describes a logical position or something like that, but it's not like a substance. And reason, like the Enlightenment Project was all about setting up reason alone as the final bar of truth. And it's like, reason is never, ever alone, whether you're the atheist at Oxford University or the Lutheran in Rockland, California. It's never alone. It's total baloney to think that there's somebody who is totally neutral, that doesn't have some element of faith, if you will, or trust in something as they begin thinking reasonably about things. So.
And again, it's the non-overlapping magisterium. It's the religion or science, but they don't touch upon each other, which is baloney.
Yeah, to be sure. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I think you're missing a big person in this whole picture. We're not asked to convert people. The Holy Spirit does that. And so you're missing the Holy Spirit. We're only asked to spark that in that person.
Be prepared.
We're just to be prepared when the Holy Spirit in that person comes to us. We're just going to give some apology, some reason for why it's true. It's up to the Holy Spirit to decide whether that grows or doesn't grow. It's not us. And so we get lost in this, and we want to convince people, and it isn't us convincing them. It's only us presenting a case.
Yes.
That's all we do.
Yeah.
And
We confess the third article of the creed and the first article.
Yes.
And the one in between, too.
Yes, that's what we do. So if, in our apologies, if you're overlooking the Holy Spirit, you're overlooking the biggest part of it.
Yeah.
And we need to kind of understand that, and that's
Here's where
that's faith. That's not. There's nothing. I'm just asked to present, the facts as I see them.
Here's where C.S. Lewis is real helpful on that particular issue. He says, from the inside of the Christian faith, the household of faith, outside, it looks like everything's sort of like, you're deciding on things based on reason and so on. When you, from the perspective of faith, inside the household of faith or inside the church, you know that that you did not choose Jesus or God, rather He chose you.
Yeah.
So, because apologetics, reason, natural law, natural theology starts in the public arena, as Luther himself put it, what you have to be as wise and subtle as he uses the term controversialist, or at least that's what the translators use. And what you have there is, he'll say elsewhere, that you do not, people, non-Christians, Jews, Turks, and other sectarians, do not believe the scriptures are the Word of God. Citing the scriptures, drawing examples from church history, pointing to the traditions of Christianity carry no weight in that arena. All you've got is your reason and your sense experience. And but he'd be very quick to add, as you did, that if anything happens there, it's solely the work of the Holy Spirit. That's another strength of the Christian faith is, to use a technical term, we're staunchly monergistic, but not to the point where it cripples us from communicating with other people. You know. Where were we?
Making mistakes.
Resources.
Yeah, who wrote that book? It's too little, I think.
So if you're wanting, so all the books I've put up here before this are not CPH books. So if you're concerned about that thing, I had to put some CPH books on here. The top is, if you're interested in natural law, reason, and its place in a Lutheran theological framework. This was maybe 10-ish years ago, Natural Law, Lutheran Reappraisal, and it's a collection of essays by LCMS theologians and one layperson. A very tall, dark, and handsome, or at least a very handsome layperson. And then this book, Making the Case for Christianity, is apologetics specifically, addressing particular challenges to the Christian faith, like atheist challenges, Muslim objections, and so on. And that's Corey Moss and I.
How old is that?
Maybe 10 years.
Okay.
It needs to be updated, but
Right.
I don't got the time. Corey can do it. There's a whole bunch more. 1517.org has a ton of resources on this. You could go, nowadays, it's remarkable, you could go on YouTube or Amazon or anywhere in between and just type in Christian apologetics and you'll be bombarded with thousands upon thousands of web pages. There's a whole lot of really good stuff out there coming from theologians from across the spectrum. All right, so what are some of the big apologetic challenges? The stuff we talked about this morning, the gender stuff, the other cultural things are not really apologetic challenges. I mean, natural law, reason, natural theology can address some of those things. There's not a whole lot. The scriptures do not give us a political philosophy. So dealing with Marxism, there are Christian questions and criticisms of Marxism, but it's not like we've got some alternative secular philosophy of politics. I mean, go to the New Testament, you've got submit to the authorities, honor the emperor. It's kind of render unto Caesar what is Caesar, under God what is God's, and pretty basic stuff. The scriptures, of course, teach that marriage is between a man and a woman, that God made people as men and women, and those sorts of things, and reason can defend those things on the grounds of reason. Is that apologetics? I don't know. I don't typically think it is, because I think apologetics is a response to an objection or a question about the faith, about the reason for the hope within us. Our hope is not because we're on the right side of politics. What is the right side of politics these days? Based on that debate that the other day, I'm like, I don't know what in the heck is going on. The hope within us is not politics. The hope within us isn't even, I would maybe go so far as to say, it's not that we have the right view of social relations. We have the right view, but that's not like hope. The reason for the hope within us is nothing more than Jesus, his blood for our sins, his resurrection for our justification. End of story. And it's in this arena, though, that there's a whole bunch of assaults on the Christian faith in the public arena. We'll talk about just 3 of them, though we could certainly talk about more. And you can see what we're going to talk about here. The first is in the public arena, in secular society, there's a whole lot of questions about whether or not the Christian understanding of God, and I'm not talking about the Trinity, just that God exists independent of the created order, whether or not there's good reason to believe that in the first place. And it's not just from like the hardcore atheists like Madeleine Murray O'Hair in the 20th century or Richard Dawkins in the 21st century. There's, have any of you ever heard the phrase, "the universe told me"?
Oh, yeah.
In California, I suspect it's probably everywhere.
Yeah.
My barber at, I go to, what is it called, Great Clips. My wife makes fun of me because I still go to where I went when I was a kid, but tells me the universe speaks to her about this, that, and the other thing all the other time. That's an expression of a monistic worldview. That's not atheistic the way that Dawkins would express it, but she's a very spiritual person, she'll tell you, but she's not religious. The universe speaks to her. So there's challenges to the Christian belief in God or what God is like that comes from a position that doesn't look like atheism. So a lot of challenges on that front. Probably the most popular, though, is the assumption, and all it is an assumption that science has led us to a position where we no longer need God to explain things. That's a motif that you find way back in the Enlightenment, expressed by, probably most famously expressed by a guy named Pierre-Simon Laplace, who wrote this book on our solar system and tried to, or he's not the first, Copernicus did it and people before him, tried to explain how it is our solar system works and especially how the planets rotate around the sun, but they seem to things kind of seem to jump around a bit. So he described it using mathematical language. Napoleon Bonaparte allegedly liked to read a lot when he's not conquering most of the known world, and would love to, in his spare time, entertain thinkers and authors. And so he invited Pierre-Simon Laplace into for dinner one night and said, Monsieur Laplace, I read your book, it's fascinating. The most fascinating thing about it, though, is the omission that I found in it. You don't mention God in any of its pages as an explanation for why things are the way they are. And Laplace famously responded, at least in legend, and there's more reason to believe that he did this than just legend, but he said, "Sir, I had no need for that hypothesis." That's right around 1800. That is to say that reason, our senses, or empirical reality, and a close enough investigation of it will discern the mysteries of the universe given enough time. The way it's expressed these days is in the, people like Richard Dawkins will say there almost certainly is no God, at least the way Christians conceive of God. The reason why he says almost certainly is to leave room for there perhaps being a God, because he has to at least present himself as having some sort of open-minded disposition. What he means by that, though, is that he readily acknowledges we don't know how or what caused what he would call the Big Bang. But we don't need to jump to God or something else for an explanation. Just let science run its course, and eventually we will know, and it won't include God as explanation. They'll usually cite, I'm amazed actually that how much Occam's razor is referred to these days. William of Ockham was a 14th, early 15th century Franciscan monk that, like, medievalists and early modern people who study the Reformation are interested in, and you hear about Occam's razor. Then all of a sudden you got all these atheists and scientists saying Occam's razor, and when they cite it, Occam's razor is this principle that's usually articulated as the easiest explanation is the right explanation. Behind it, though, it's a little more complicated. His razor says that when explaining the world, do not multiply entities beyond that which is necessary. That is, in explaining how the universe got here, don't add to the explanation by suggesting there's some other thing that exists like God. You've got the universe, stick with that and work out a naturalistic explanation of things. That would be the assumption of scientism, not science. But nevertheless, that's where a lot of objections to the Christian faith come from, this basic assumption that we don't need God to explain things. There are those, however, who work in the arena of science. A lot of people, it seems, as of late, who would say, au contraire. That's the last time I'm going to do that. There's lots we could cite. I'm going to recommend, if you're into this kind of stuff, Stephen C. Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, is the greatest thing since, I don't know if it's sliced bread or something, but it's outstanding, honest response to this attitude that God's existence does not need to be suggested to explain things. And in that book, Stephen C. Meyer is not a Lutheran, just for the record. He's an intelligent design thinker, works out of the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington. But in this book, the first part of it, he says, one of the reasons why people have suggested we don't need God to explain how the universe got here and why it is there's so much apparent design in the created order and so on, is because there's this old narrative that just doesn't correspond to reality, that says that theology and science have always been at odds with each other, and when science was finally able to break free and work without any sort of theological interaction, that's when all these tremendous advances took place, all these great discoveries. Theology or religion always stifles science. Stephen Meyer says, if you look at the record of science, some of the greatest thinkers in the scientific tradition in the West have been thoroughgoing Christians. So, the father of chemistry, Pierre Bayle, last name is, it's a B, it's escaping me. This is in the 18th century, said that just like theologians in the decades or centuries past discovered that theology is not about what God must be like, but rather how he's made himself known, which is a real Lutheran insight, interestingly enough, so too science, natural science, is not about what the universe must be like, the way the Greeks and the tradition of science that developed after that put it, but rather science is about describing the world as it actually is. And in his writings, Robert Boyle, not Pierre, Robert Boyle, in his writings he says, modern science has basically adopted the methodology of the theology of the Reformers. That is, taking the data from Scripture as pieces of evidence and constructing a larger picture of things from that. And so that's what science does, looks at particulars, develops a theory, a larger picture or explanation of things based on that particular evidence. So Meyer says, you find instances like this throughout the history of science. In fact, the scientific methodology can be, the introduction of it as a process where you're constantly testing whether what you think is the case is actually really the case, started not in laboratories, but anybody know where it started? Like Roger Bacon and others? Monasteries is where the modern scientific method is really born. So it says, so the narrative and this idea that theology and science are in two completely separate watertight compartments, such that there's this, you mentioned non-overlapping magisteria, Stephen Jay Gould's thesis, that they are like two totally different things is total rubbish. That theology and science, or worldview and science, are not exactly the same thing, but there's a lot of, like the presidential hopeful likes, what are those things, the Venn diagram. She loves Venn diagrams. They overlap. I didn't want to get political. I think that's the most I'm going to say political. I got a lot more I want to say, but we'll wait till Oktoberfest.
Yes.
So we need to get rid of that false understanding of the way science works. He says, and so what does science tell us? Now this is kind of a high-level book in the sense that he's not doing like particulars, he's looking at big picture. He says, in the 20th century, a number of things have been discovered, is the word he's going to be used, or the word he's going to use, that lead necessarily is probably a little too strong, but I'm going to use the word, almost necessarily to the position that God has to exist in order to explain things. So, what are those things? There's a number of them. There's 3 big ones he's going to look at. He says, if you look at the early 20th century, let's say 1900 is a roundabout number, most natural scientists, astronomers, and everything thought that the universe was eternal, that it existed from all eternity. Why did they think that? Because there was evidence for it? No, because they needed it to be eternal, because otherwise God would have to exist. Then all of a sudden, people, scientists like, not Fred Hoyle, Hubble. Edwin Hubble, is it Edwin or Irwin? Edwin Hubble, when he's looking at the night sky on the top of that, I think it's Mount Wilson, just outside of Pasadena, he starts noticing things about it with his grad students, that it looks like the universe is receding away or expanding. Then they notice like this, they call it a change in red shift. Then they start picking up this background microwave radiation, these echoes of some big bang, as Fred Hoyle put it. And they start developing a theory, and this is not me endorsing, I don't even know, I'm no scientist, I don't know a whole lot about it, but start developing this theory that the universe is temporal, not eternal. That is to say, it had a beginning. And it began with some, as Fred Hoyle put it as kind of a joke, as some sort of Big Bang. So now the Big Bang Theory, again, I don't know much about it. I don't know how reconcilable it is with the Christian worldview. I know Christians who have an older view of things find it quite handy. We're not going to get into those issues. I don't know enough about them, and if I have a position, which at Oktoberfest I might tell you, but that it would be a distraction. The Big Bang Theory is somewhat helpful if it really is where science is on this particular issue, and I know there are those like Roger Penrose who are starting to question it. It says that the universe is temporal. That is, it came out of nowhere. It came ex nihilo. The traditional Christian understanding of the universe is a doctrine of creation ex nihilo, from nothing. So if you got something popping into existence, in the reasoning of people like William Lane Craig, it's got to have a cause, or at least science, it looks for a cause. So you've got 2 options there. It's either a supernatural cause. It couldn't have caused itself, because that would require it existed before it existed. That's just like word magic there, right? But it couldn't have caused itself. There has to be some sort of external agent that brought it into existence, or intelligence, or something like that. The 2 options are a creator, like God, or what's entertained nowadays, increasingly so, even though it's the stuff of Marvel Comics, is multiverse theory. That our universe arrived, or sort of was planted, or is somehow the result of other universes that exist alongside of, or before, or maybe even still alongside of our universe. And there's a number of different theories that are mathematically possible. But when you look at the numbers, it's so astronomically high that John Lennox at Oxford University would say it's not even worth pursuing, despite Victor Stanger's proposal. Yes, sir?
Well, as a scientist, I'll tell you, you actually only have one, because you're just doing a regression here. You're saying, okay, where did the multiverses come from? You're just pushing it back one more step. You still haven't. There has to be something external to everything that we have that created everything. And there's no way around this. No matter how they argue, there is nothing that doesn't say there has to be some external cause. And that external cause is God. That won't get us any close to Jesus, but it at least gets us to say that there is.
It's a good step.
Well, I mean, at least you can say, like a deist say, there was something that started all this going.
Mm-hmm.
That's as close as it gets us. But there's only the one, because the multiverse thing is a diversion. It doesn't do anything. It just moves it back one more step. That's all it does.
I'm glad you said that, because you're a scientist and you confirm my bias. But exactly that. So I mentioned this guy, William Lane Craig, out of Biola University, has put together a very handy argument for God's existence based on this. It goes like this. It says the major premise is whatever begins to exist has a cause. And it's not whatever exists, but whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe, per the Big Bang Theory, says that the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And it has a first cause. Introduce multiple worlds hypothesis or multiverse theory, you're just pushing it back, and you get into this infinite regress. Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Kicking the can down the road.
Yes, it's exactly what it's like.
That's all
Yeah.
you're doing. And then they're gonna say, well, who caused the cause? And then you can just simply say, it's not within our purview, it's not within our universe, it's not within our realm of existence to even know what that is. So we can't possibly even discuss that. It's beyond the discussion of any kind of discussion that we have, because we don't know anything about that
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. And then, as a side note, if you teach like young adults or grades, elementary, middle school kids, or even high school kids, there's a great, I don't know if it's not like a documentary, but it's not a movie either. It was called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. With Ben Stein. Remember Ben Stein from
I have a copy of that.
It's really good at illustrating about this sort of thing that's going on in science, and correct me if I'm wrong, where there are those who do real science, who are just like testing all their theories and trying to falsify what they think they know the way that you ought to do. But then there are those who are practicing not science but scientism, which is an ideology, and they cannot allow, not only can they not allow a supposition that there might be a creator, they can't even allow you to say, won't allow you to say that it looks like there's some design or order or code in DNA. Because if there is that requires a mind or an intelligence behind things. And so you get people like Eugenie Scott, who I think she's now retired, but she was the president of the National Council on Science Education, it basically was her bailiwick, was collecting data from schools everywhere, especially public schools, figuring out where anybody was daring to suggest that the human eye, for example, would not work in any sort of prior stage of its evolution, in what's called irreducible complexity. Because if you dare suggest that the eye is irreducibly complex, that suggests it was created or maybe even evolved with a particular purpose. And there can't be purpose in an atheistic view of the universe. That would suggest a mind. Like there's a design behind things. So anyway, I'm getting too far into the weeds. So for Meyer, it says, Big Bang Theory, it might challenge, especially like a young Earth type of creationist, but at the very least, its demonstration that the universe is temporal is of great benefit to Christians in the apologetic and natural theology realm. There's more to it though. He says, at the Big Bang theorists, and I don't want to go into too far because I might make a mistake and you'll correct me and embarrass me. But as those cosmologists have studied it, they've discovered, I think Einstein is not the first, but really kind of made this famous, that the universe, at the moment of the Big Bang, there are certain parameters, what they call things that had to be exactly as they are for the universe in its natural history to, forgive me for using this word, but evolve the way it did. Otherwise, the universe would have flown apart or would have collapsed in on itself. The distribution of atoms and gases and so on wouldn't have been right for there to be life on planet Earth. They call it the fine-tuning argument and cosmological constants, gravity and anti-gravity being just the right way and so on. And it all had to be, there's at least a dozen, some say upwards of 24 things that had to be exactly the way they are, or we would not even be here to be observing any of this whatsoever. So you've got that. And then he says, if you look at the natural history of things, and Stephen C. Meyer is probably what we might, he's not at the, he's an old Earth kind of creationist. He kind of works with the theory of evolution, but not in a Darwinian way. But he says if you look at the history of the fossil record, things like the Cambrian explosion, and there's other explosions where, like in the layer of the fossils, there's all sorts of real simple things. Then all of a sudden these really complex organisms start to appear almost out of nowhere with no, what we might call like a missing link, suggesting a whole bunch of new genetic information was added into living organisms. Where did that come from? And that it's information, genetic information, that arranged certain ways, just information, code, causes proteins to take shape, and organs and organisms start to take the shape and do the things that they do, all suggest that there's a mind or a creator behind things, but not even in a deistic conception, in a theistic conception, because as information is added along the natural history of the universe or Earth, looking at that particularly, something's alongside of it, adding to it all along the way. A deist says it's all set up from the beginning and then God leaves. A theist, and it's like you said earlier, you're not gotten any closer to the God of Christianity, but the best explanation in using what's called abductive reasoning in terms of worldview is certainly not atheism.
No.
It's not even deism, but rather classic theism, this belief that there's a God who created things and over the course of the history of his creation does intervene as he sees fit in a providential sort of way. So at the end of the Return of the God hypothesis, Stephen C. Meyer argues, and he's over the course of his career, he's always been very careful in not over-asserting things. Like he wrote a book called Signature in the Cell. And as much as he wants to argue like a Christian case, he says what all his research on genetics has told him is that there's information that is coded in every individual human cell that does things. It does, tells the cells to do things. He says nothing works that way apart from a designer. To quote the famous theologian Bill Gates, I think Meyer quotes him in that book. He says that genetic code is more complicated by a magnitude than any sort of software coding that he's ever seen. And behind software or code is always some sort of designer behind the scenes. So at the end of his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, Meyer turns Pierre-Simon Laplace's statement that there's no need for God to explain things on its head and says, in fact, God is necessary for all the evidence that we have based on the discoveries, the scientific discoveries that he covers in the book. Then he says, and I think it's quite fascinating the way he puts it, he says, scientists, natural scientists are going to, in the future, if they're honest and if they're dealing not just in describing their laboratory experiments, but trying to figure out the best sort of worldview that accounts for things, they're going to find themselves increasingly doing the work of natural theology, or what was in former centuries called natural theology, former decades, than what has recently been called natural science. Then he uses an illustration from a book called God and the Astronomers, that science is now at a place where for decades, if not centuries, scientists have been climbing Mount Olympus, figuring out the mysteries of the universe, thinking they're doing it all on their own, and they're the ones who have sort of been leading the way in the knowledge that we all have about the universe. And as they get to the top, or the peak of Mount Olympus, they're going to be surprised when all of a sudden they see that they're not the ones who are the only ones who are there, but there are a whole bunch of theologians who are sitting on the top who have been there all along. So, outstanding book for defending from a scientific perspective the reasonableness for God's existence and the rationality of the theistic worldview. There are other ways to respond to those who would challenge you and the reasonableness in believing in God's existence from like moral arguments and things like that. We could do that over Q&A. We just don't have the time for that now. But one point I do want to bring up with regard to this sort of apologetic front is, as you said earlier, you don't, like to use the words of C.S. Lewis in your words, just because you persuaded somebody there's good reason to believe God exists, doesn't mean you've gotten anywhere close to Christianity. It's not until people start asking, what does that mean then for me, especially when I realize, or a person realizes that they are out of a relationship, to use modern language, with God, that Christianity finally does begin to speak. So, second thing, second major apologetic front in the public arena is there is across the board, from Muslims on one side to atheists on the other, and others in between, all sorts of criticisms, attacks, or questions asked about the person and work of Jesus and whether or not the Christian view of Jesus is legitimate. It can be things like Muslims who will quote Quran chapter 5 or chapter 4, where they will say, yeah, Jesus was a prophet and did perform miracles and things like that, but we know from history, a Muslim might say, in fact I've heard it time and again, that he did not die, he wasn't even crucified. And they will argue that the historical Christ is the Christ that Christians believe in is not the historical Jesus, but rather their view of Jesus, that he escaped death and was taken up into heaven instead by Allah, is the more historical view. That's one accusation. There's 1.6 billion Muslims who believe that. There are people on the other side, like Elaine Pagels, once Princeton and I think at Harvard University, she might be retired now, who say that, yeah, Christians have some pretty distinct views about Jesus. There are some Christians who think that they got Jesus right because they base their view of Jesus on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But then she'll be quick to add and say, well, there are other ancient sources for Jesus' life that tell a different story about Jesus. Why not go with those? And then she'll suggest that perhaps the early church, or not perhaps, but the early church arbitrarily chose certain gospels because it advanced their particular bias about Jesus over and against others. What she's talking about is the stuff you'll see on documentaries, like on History Channel doesn't really do history anymore, but Aliens is what they do. But History Channel sometimes will run a documentary about the origins of Christianity, or the Discovery Channel or PBS, where they will explore non-canonical gospels or Gnostic gospels. And there's a whole bunch of these things. And they are ancient documents. There's the Gospel of Thomas and Peter and Judas and infancy gospels, and at least there's 12 fairly complete ones, and then if you add to it fragments that we have from these non-canonical gospels, it's close to 24 of these things. And they do tell a different story about Jesus in different ways. The Gospel of Peter is a fragment that was found in a coffin of a monk back in the late 19th century. And it picks up on the tomb on Easter, what we call Easter morning. And the stone's been rolled away, and then as the story goes, there's these two angels that come out of the tomb. As they come out, their necks are extended into heaven. And then behind the angels, a cross comes out, almost like a bouncing pogo stick is kind of the picture you get. Like a wooden cross comes out, and then you hear a voice that says, "Have you preached?" And the cross says, "Yavul," but the cross, it says, "Yes, I have preached." And that's the end of the story. I'm like, well, that's a little weird. Or you get what's been discovered as a forgery, though still some ideological groups advance it as a legitimate gospel, called the Secret Gospel of Mark, where Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and there's that boy. There's two verses to it. There's a guy there whose robes get caught, and he runs away naked. He meets up with Jesus later on, and Jesus teaches him the secrets to the kingdom in the Secret Gospel of Mark, where it's just taken to mean that Jesus was having a homosexual affair with maybe Mark. Then you get the Gospel of Thomas that has a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't contradict the canonical Gospels, but has a few places where it's a little weird. For example, the last there's 114 anecdotes in there. The 114th says, "For a woman to be saved, she must first become a man." Can you guess what group likes this gospel? So you get these sorts of things. You get the, we don't have an actual fragment of it, but we have quotations from a gospel of Basilides, who said that there was a body nailed to the cross that everybody believed was Jesus' body, but Jesus had actually left his body and went off and became a spirit kind of being and things like that. So you get, there's a whole bunch of this stuff that the Christian church has been aware of. The church fathers quote or refer to it in their literature, and they tell us why it was not read in churches and ultimately wasn't included in the list of the books, the canon of the New Testament. Not because they arbitrarily chose Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but rather none of them passed historical muster. None of them were written by eyewitnesses of Jesus' life or companions of eyewitnesses of Jesus' life. None of them were written at a time where people who knew Jesus or eyewitnesses of Jesus' life could have checked them. They're all written way too late to have been considered or even gotten close to being considered for being canonical. In fact, while Elaine Pagels and others can say there's other ancient gospels that tell us a different story of Jesus, so calling into question the orthodox picture of Jesus, they're being a little deceptive, because all those other ancient gospels, while they are very old, all of them were written way too late to have been written by the names that are attached to that. The earliest of the non-canonical gospels is the Gospel of Thomas, which that seems like it might be a good, if it was legitimately the Gospel of Thomas, it'd be a good source. Problem is, the title Gospel of Thomas was added later on to lend credibility to the document. And there's an overwhelming majority of scholars, that doesn't mean they're all right, but the overwhelming majority of scholars in analyzing the three manuscripts we have of that Gospel have demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt that it is drawn from a work called the Diatessaron, Tatian's Diatessaron from 175 AD. So more than 200 years after sorry, my math, I'm history, 150 years, and it's like 150 years after Jesus' life, so not an eyewitness. And the rest are all much later. In fact, the Secret Gospel of Mark is a 20th century forgery done by a guy named Morton Smith, otherwise known by his friends as Morton the Baldy, because he was bald, but he was also a homosexual man, and so when he was on sabbatical, he forges the secret gospel and sandwiches it in an old collection of manuscripts in a monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, takes pictures of it, and then writes two books that were that were sensations in the 1980s and 90s. And then when other scholars went to see if this was actually legitimate, they go to the library at the monastery, and lo and behold, it's not even there anymore. So he took pictures with it in that manuscript collection, so it looked legitimate. But then he knew he'd get caught, so he took it out and trashed it. An even better one, just while we're doing this stuff, is anybody heard of the Gospel of Barnabas? If you, as you're traveling around here in Sacramento and you see an Islamic bookstore, some of us stop and go in. If you go to an Islamic bookstore, you'll see in their section called Christianology, their study of Christianity or genre, there will be a bunch of books on the spine will be the Gospel of Barnabas. And you'll be like, oh, that's pretty interesting. Never heard of the Gospel of Barnabas, nor has the Christian church, because the Gospel of Barnabas didn't exist until the 15th century, when a Dominican converted to Islam in the Ottoman Empire and wrote the Gospel of Barnabas so that the life and teachings of Jesus corresponded to Quranic teachings, and they used it as a work for proselytizing Christians caught in prisoner of war camps. There's not that you asked, but I'll give this to you for free even. There's a Lutheran pastor from Nuremberg in the early 17th century named Solomon Schweiger, who was chosen by the Habsburg Empire to be a chaplain to the Habsburg ambassador to the Ottomans. When he goes there, he travels down the Danube River to Istanbul. He hears about all these Christians living in Istanbul who are servants and slaves and so on, and then he hears about this prison camp there from recent people taken captive and getting ready to sell them into slavery. And he goes to this prison camp, and he meets this guy named Adam Neuser, who's now taken on the name of Ali. And Ali, he's converted to Islam, it seems, because Muslims can't take other Muslims as slaves. He's hoping to gain his freedom. And Solomon goes, he's heard about this guy, and he goes to Adam/Ali and tries to evangelize him or win him back to the Christian faith. And Ali allegedly gave him a copy of the Gospel of Barnabas and says, "No, I found the true gospel." And whether it was all orchestrated so he could get his freedom or not, it's hard to say. It's a diary entry of Solomon Schweiger's. But anyway, the Gospel of Barnabas is fascinating because there's 3 manuscripts, 2 in Spanish, 1 in Italian or vice versa, that were discovered in these old libraries back in the very early 20th century, around 1907. And scholars are like, wow, this is fascinating, we should study this thing. And they studied it for several years. And then a translation was made into English, published by Oxford University Press with about a 99-page introduction that shows and proves beyond a reasonable doubt that while the manuscripts were from the 15th and early 16th century, there's no reason to believe that this manuscript was circulated before then, because all the language in it referred to stuff that didn't exist and were idioms that weren't used until the 15th century and afterwards. And so showed that this is a historical curiosity, but it certainly is not an ancient lost gospel or anything like that. So what do, like Darul Islam, this famous Muslim publishing house, what they do is they take the Gospel of Barnabas, which has Jesus saying, "Behold, I'm a prophet of Allah." And or Moses prophesied of me, and I prophesy of another prophet who will come after me named Muhammad. And then at the end of his life, he hears that he's going to be arrested. And so he's with his disciples in an upper room, and he looks around the room and says, "Hey, they're coming for me. Who wants to be arrested in my place?" And can anybody guess who raises his hand? Judas raises his hand. His face is transformed so he looks like Jesus. Jesus kind of slips off in the background. Judas is arrested and crucified in Jesus' place. Is
that what Islam actually believes about Jesus?
Yeah.
Or is it like there's like a divine doppelganger?
It's
Or
both,
like
yeah. So there's like an actual divine face lift that takes place in the text.
Like, is it someone comes down, or is it like literally Judas who's crucified?
It's Judas. Now there's other traditions too. There's some say that no, Jesus was arrested and he was beaten or flogged, but then as he's carrying his cross to the to Golgotha, because it's Deuteronomy that says a cursed is when he was hung from a tree, because Allah would not allow one of his prophets to be dishonored. In that mix-up that takes place where Simon the Cyrene is made to take the cross, Jesus just sort of, he's got a crown of thorns, he's bloody, he just sort of slips off in the background. And then, anybody know where he goes? Anybody been to India? Why would you go to Kashmir? There's a place up in northwestern India that has the tomb of Jesus, because Jesus left and was looking for the lost tribes of Israel. He didn't know they were in America, like the Mormons. I'm told that the locals there who charge, I don't know how much they charge, but they charge a fair amount of money to go see the tomb of Jesus. I don't know why people would do this, but they all, there's no bones underneath there, and they all know it. But they love taking Westerners. So there you have it. But there's a book out there called Jesus in India that you'll find in Islamic bookstores that tell about where Jesus went. The traditional view in Islam, though, is in that upper room is Jesus and Judas, basically their faces are transformed, or Judas's face is transformed. Jesus is taken up into heaven, and he's awaiting his return, where he will, Quran chapter 5 says, when he's asked by Allah if he told Christians that they should regard him as Lord alongside his mother Mary, Jesus says, I would have never taught him such a thing. And then at that point, like every other human in the Islamic view, Jesus finally dies and then is immediately resurrected along with everybody else. And he will begin, this is not in the Quran, but Islamic traditional material says he will join forces with Muslims and the Islamic Messiah and hunt down Jews collect crucifixes and crush them, and then begin ushering in this global Islamic caliphate. It's going to be awesome. Not really, but... so there are things like that floating around. Some of them are ancient. They are not, there's a reason why they're not in our Bible. Now, if Thomas really did write a gospel, he didn't. But if he really did, it probably would have been included in our Bible. If, hypothetically, if a work was discovered of St. Paul, and it could be shown to have been written by St. Paul, and theologically it conformed to it, but primarily it was written by St. Paul or Peter or some other eyewitness, there would be serious discussions within the Christian church of whether or not that should be brought into, should be read in churches. The process in the early church was not arbitrary selection or confirmation bias. I mean, theologically it had to conform, but even more importantly, it had to have been written by a person who would have known, or a person who could have, whose writing would have been checked by the apostles or other eyewitnesses. So it's not an arbitrary thing. Dan Brown was not doing history in that work, the Da Vinci Code, when he says there would be no doctrine of the deity of Christ had it not been for Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, the Nicene Creed, and the late establishment of the Christian canon, and so on. That's all hogwash. But even so, there's still others out there who will say, yeah, not only are there different pictures of Jesus, but let's just pretend, they will say, well, I don't know if they'd say that way, but people like Bart Ehrman, another scholar, quite prominent scholar, will say, yeah, all those other gospels aren't really, they're historical curiosities, and they tell us about some Christian groups, heretical Christian groups that we otherwise wouldn't know anything about. He'll go on and say, there are better sources for understanding who Jesus really was. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Bart Ehrman would acknowledge. He'd say, however, even those aren't that reliable, because as we now know, and as he's made very public in all sorts of popular, or books for popular consumption, there are so many variants in the manuscripts behind our published translations of the Bible that one cannot trust what they're reading. In my mind, this is complicated, but also probably one of the most important apologetic issues of our day, because it's like the Jesus Seminar. Some of you might have heard about it, or even maybe read some stuff from the Jesus Seminar in the late 1980s and 1990s. Bart Ehrman now is the first to bring stuff out of the academy that's been wrestled with for a long time, and make it available for mass consumption, such that you can find Ehrman's book, or could find when it was first published, Misquoting Jesus, on the Sam's Club and Costco book tables, and made all this stuff available for everybody to read, but uses it for polemical purposes, not to advance some sort of scholarship in the popular arena, but to ultimately attack Christianity. So what does Ehrman do? He's got a bunch of books, paperback books, that are written for people like you and me, where he will make claims like this. In Misquoting Jesus, he says, of all the manuscripts we have, that is handwritten copies of the New Testament, there are approximately 200 to 400,000 variants across the manuscripts. He will go on and say most of these variants don't mean a whole lot, but there are some that do. There are some that introduce new things, and probably there are things that have been taken out of the text. So you can't be confident that the New Testament has been reliably transmitted to us today. Now, our faith is not in the Bible. That's not the object of our faith. The object of our faith is Jesus. But if you don't got a reliable a New Testament that has been reliably transmitted to it, and I'm using the word reliably purposely, that's a historian's category. This is before an argument for inspiration and inerrancy or anything like that. Just has it been reliably transmitted to us? Undermining that goes a long way at undermining people's confidence that the Jesus that you and I confess, which is the Jesus of faith, but also the Jesus of history, might not be the case. People like Dan Brown or Bart Ehrman or somebody in between might have a better take on things. I don't know about you in the university arena, young people who are looking for excuses to justify leaving the faith or things like that more often than not, this is the issue for them. Now, is it a smoke screen for a psychological thing, or they're trying to get away from the Christian faith so they can pursue their sexual adventures? Probably there's a lot to that, but this is the thing that's more often than not stated. And because it's an objection, at least a stated objection to Christian faith, Christians in that sort of context, it behooves them to be able to respond to those sorts of things. So how does one respond to Ehrman's claim that there are so many variants, and some of those variants suggest things have been added to or taken away from the text, undermine the credibility or the reliability of the text? Lots of ways to tackle this issue. None of them are easy, but here's a few little pointers. First of all, source material. Bart Ehrman is not the only one who studies New Testament manuscripts. Christians have been studying New Testament manuscripts for centuries and have acknowledged that there are variants among the New Testament manuscripts for centuries. It's never undermined anybody's understanding of its reliable transmission. Okay? Bart Ehrman's kind of an outlier on that. In fact, most people who study the New Testament manuscripts, including those who are not Christians, say, yeah, this thing's been, compared to any other ancient literature, really reliably transmitted to us, such that we can be quite confident that we know what was originally written, even though we don't have those first documents. So what's going on with this claim? There are lots and lots of variants, and you're going to have to be patient here. Don't think about where's that pole and those sticks so we can tie Francisco up and set a fire and burn them at the stake. There are lots and lots of variants. Just open up a good critical study Bible, or even the Pew Bible that the CPH publishes will have footnotes pointing out where many of these variants are. The reason why there are so many of them is because there's so many manuscripts of the New Testament. So if you were to take just Greek, New Testament's written in Greek, and you were to count up all the fragments and all the complete or near complete handwritten copies of the New Testament in Greek, you would have close to 5,900 manuscripts that have actually been studied. Now there's a whole lot more that hasn't been looked at. In fact, years ago, 2004-ish, I think it was, I was at this conference in Oxford, New Testament and Apostolic Fathers Conference. They had it once in 1904 and then again in 2004. And I got this job as the TA for that conference, meaning setting up people's lodging and stuff. Well, it's not a big deal because I thought it was kind of cool at first, but then I learned I was the only applicant. But, so I had to register people and post stuff online, which meant I know nothing about computers, so I would just go to the computer lab and say, hey, can you help me figure out how to do this, and let them do the work, and I got to take the credit. But all these scholars from around the world, people like John Dominic Crossan, the Jesus Seminar guy, John Kloppenberg, another Jesus Seminar guy, Bart Ehrman, Elaine Page, all the who's who. I didn't know any of these people though, because I was a Reformation historian. Bart Ehrman comes to I didn't know who he was, but he comes to the front desk to register. I'm like, can I have your name? He's like, you don't know who I am?
Mike Tyson.
I'm like, sorry, I don't. I'm just a Reformation. He goes, I'm Bart Ehrman. I'm like, oh, okay, so got him sorted. But in that conference, they had a time where they were offering tours of the Ashmolean, the first museum. You could go in the basement, and you could go to this room where they do all this sort of digital laser sort of studying of manuscripts that are still rolled up, and they can discern like what's on what page. It's fascinating stuff. But they had pallets, and the person who was giving us this tour said that at the British Museum in London, they had tons of pallets filled with ancient manuscripts, like dozens of pallets with these boxes that are about 3 feet high, with with just stuff dumped in there. Said, in fact, there's stuff there still from the discovery at Oxyrhynchus in the 1890s that nobody's looked at, so nobody knows what's there. Before very recent technological advancements, studying that stuff was a long and arduous process. If it's rolled up and it's been sitting in an Egyptian desert in actually a trash heap for 1,900 years, or give or take, you got to slowly unravel that stuff. And it takes a certain sort of person who's going to want to dedicate their life to studying a thing that might not even be a thing. You might unravel and it's a receipt for barley and hops or something like that. You never know what you're going to discover. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that's still to be studied. But currently, there are about 5,900 Greek manuscripts that have been cataloged. It was like 5,862 a couple of years ago, so I'm just saying 5,900, we'll just be safe there. Add to that lectionaries, so like the readings, the set readings in Christian churches, bless you, which could be in Greek, or could be in Latin, it could be in Coptic or some other language, and then translations of the New Testament. You've got somewhere around 25,000 manuscripts, okay? That's a whole heck of a lot. Now, there are other ancient documents that have hundreds of manuscripts behind their printed versions. Like Homer's Iliad, I think, is the most. There's about 2,000, but that's the most. A lot of them, though, it's just a handful of manuscripts. So, late 1st, early 2nd century historians, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Josephus, you've probably heard of Josephus. There are maybe about 200, 300 manuscripts of those three authors. Nobody, and it's about 800 to 1,000 years from when they wrote and when we actually have manuscripts. And nobody really questions whether they've been reliably transmitted to us. New Testament, 24,000 manuscripts. The earliest, it's hard to know exactly, but it seems it's called Parchment 52 in John Ryland's library. It's a little fragment from John 18, about the size of a 3x5 card. Dates to a conservative dating is about 120 AD. Some will put it earlier to about 90, 95 AD. That's still, for ancient documents, super, super duper, to use technical language, early in terms of the transmission from when it was first written to when you actually have a copy. So you got a whole lot of manuscripts and a pretty good transmission record. It's the best case scenario, in fact, for ancient historical documents. If you were to take those manuscripts, just to illustrate it visually, and to get to why there are so many variants, and stack them on top of each other, if it was those three authors I mentioned earlier, Josephus, Suetonius, and Tacitus, you'd have a stack of manuscripts about this high. Okay? And that's really good. It's awesome. People like Pastor Fro's son-in-law love that stuff. They spend their whole careers like geeks studying that stuff. They can tell you all about emperors and so on. New Testament, stack them on top of each other, it's over a mile high. And if you, what are called text critics, that is people who study the text of the New Testament like analytically, they're not higher critics, though some contend that way. They're just like close studiers of the New Testament text. It's people like Chuck Geeshin and Jim Veltz, Jeff Kloha, and others within our circles. Those who, when they're studying it and they're trying to determine how many variants there might be, they, not arbitrarily, but they assume a set text. They'll take like the late 3rd, early 4th century complete copy or manuscripts of the New Testament, our earliest complete copies, either the one in the Vatican or up in Ireland, and say, well, these are the earliest complete, this is the earliest complete manuscript. We're just going to use this as the set text and compare all the other manuscripts to it. Anytime there's a variance in copying, it counts as a variant. And there are lots of them. Ehrman says upwards of 400,000. Daniel Wallace, who is like the guy, I think, if you're looking at this stuff, University of Dallas Theological Seminary, we won't hold it against him. He now heads up the Center for Study of New Testament Manuscripts, says there might be as high as 1 million variants. Just, if you look at them though, all but less than 1% make any real difference. The overwhelming majority, something like 75% of them, are things like whether or not John's name or Jesus' name has a definite article, a "the" in front of it or not. Some have it, some don't. But every time that there's that variance, it counts. Sometimes, in the way the Greek was originally written, is there's no spacing between words. So what scribes would do to break up the words is it wouldn't, for whatever reason, they wouldn't do spacing. They'd put in what's called a movable nu. That's an N. So if a word ends with a vowel and the next word starts with a vowel, to break it up, they put a movable nu there. And there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of those. Those all count as variants. The word order, like the Latin language, Greek language works similarly in that it's inflected, in that word order isn't as important in rendering the sense of a sentence. It's rather what you do to the verb and the noun that tells you whether it's in the subject or the predicate, and whether the adjective goes with what noun, and so on and so forth. So what you get is there are hundreds of thousands of these things where in manuscripts it'll be a sentence will be rendered one way, and then you get another manuscript where you read through the sentence, it's the same way, but then there's a word missing and it's added to the end of a sentence. We don't know exactly what's going on there, but most likely when scribes are copying a manuscript or they're hearing an abbot in a monastery read the Greek New Testament, and it's 8 o'clock at night, they've just had some ale after dinner, and they're like, they don't even know the Greek language, and they're writing down, they've learned what the Greek, what the letters that correspond to the sound look like. They're writing it down, maybe they miss a word, they get to the end of the sentence, everybody's checking things, they're like, oh shoot, I forgot that word. Rather than throwing away this very expensive piece of parchment, I'm just going to tack it on to the end. So you get things like that. Sometimes you get you get misspellings. John's name, for example, is sometimes rendered with one nu or N, sometimes with two. Tens of thousands of those things. That's like 75% of the variance. What about like the other 24% before we get to that 1% that matter, that are both viable and meaningful, as they put it? Most of the others are just silly little mistakes that seem to make a difference, but it seems like you just got a sloppy copyist. So you'll get, for example, I mentioned that passage from Mark chapter 2. I think it's chapter 2. Maybe it's Mark chapter 1. Is it chapter 1? Don't fact check me. It's Mark chapter 1 and chapter 2 where Jesus is either angry or he has compassion on a leper. There is a manuscript that has the verb gets angry. What seems some think happened is some will prefer, like the translators of the NIV prefer the verb for got angry, because they thought that the other manuscripts that have took compassion was a correction, because nobody can stand an angry Jesus, so they changed it to compassion. You get things like that. They're really rare, but they are there. And if you got 25,000 manuscripts, that number is going to count up. I'm trying to think of some other. Sometimes they're just silly mistakes, like kairos, time or season, is sometimes they forget the ros and it's kai, so the word and. You get things like that that are about 25%. So a conservative estimate, meaning one that is careful not to oversert the case, would say that 99%, even Bart Ehrman will say 99% of these variants don't matter one bit. What are the ones that matter? We already referred to one, the ending of the Gospel of Mark. If you look at a footnote in your study Bibles, it will say some of the earliest manuscripts don't have chapter 16, verse 9 through, I think it's 20 actually. I think it's at 16.
Study Bible puts it right inside the verses.
Yeah, it'll have like brackets, or look at a footnote or an asterisk or something, depending on what Bible it is. It'll say some of the earliest manuscripts don't have this. Notice the word some, because there are others that do. And there's church fathers that don't quote it verbatim, but seem to reference that long ending. So nobody's really sure what's going on there. This is going to be offensive to some of you, maybe. Probably not. But the way to handle that is not to say, well, Luther includes a verse in the small catechism from that, so it must stand. That's okay, but it's not like a good way of approaching whether or not it's like authentic. But let's just say, hypothetically speaking, you just got rid of it. Would it change anything? Doctrine or historicity of the text? No. I think it's authentic, but I don't know whether it was somebody added it on or who knows what's going on with the ending of Mark. And then there's a story of the woman caught in adultery, John chapter 7, verse 53 through 8, verse 11. Not in the earliest manuscripts. I don't think it appears till the 6th century. But there are some church fathers who kind of seem to suggest a story like that. So we don't know what's going on with those two things. In the Gospels, those are the big issues. And they're issues scholars have wrestled with for a long time. Bart Ehrman will use them in a text to say, see, this has gone missing here, and then it's later added on. What else has gone missing or has been added on? The proper response to that is, well, what evidence do we have? There are other things, and there isn't. So what's happened with, as an illustration of how this stuff can be kind of silly, is Ehrman, in his misquoting Jesus, can make all these wild claims and ask all these conjectural type of questions, like, well, what else was taken away, or what else was added to the text? And when he first published Misquoting Jesus, a whole bunch of scholars wrote, including Daniel Wallace, wrote to Harper Row and said, this clearly didn't go through peer review. The claims he's making, no scholar who's writing under peer review, which isn't a perfect process by any stretch of the imagination, but no scholar who's had his work checked by other scholars, specialists in this field, would let this fly. And so the editor, in the latest edition of Misquoting Jesus, added an appendix to the end of him interviewing Bart Ehrman, addressing the challenges of some of the serious scholarly objections to his book. And the editor asked him point blank, do the variants that you find in the New Testament manuscripts change any Christian doctrine or affect the historicity of the narrative concerning Jesus' life? Jesus' life. And Ehrman says, no. But who reads appendices? Well, sorry, guilty as charged, but it's fascinating that stuff takes place. But so all this stuff that seems to have the air of scholarly credibility, and Ehrman's a stud in many ways. He's no slouch. He studied with Bruce Metzger. He knows the ancient world like no other. He will use his scholarship for polemical purposes. A lot of books that are put out there in the realm of Christian history and doctrine that are written for mass consumption that you find at places like Barnes and Noble, some of it's very good. Some of it has ulterior motives. It's published designed to undermine the Christian faith. And these guys and gals get exposed when Christians like Daniel Wallace and others start pressing the screws on them. They come clean and say, yeah, I was exaggerating the case there or whatnot. You can take Ehrman's old work published by Oxford, and it's nowhere near the stuff he publishes later. Of course, the stuff he publishes later he made a ton of money on, so always follow the money on that stuff. Did you have your hand up?
Can you define polemic?
Argumentative in a way that's not like a scholarly argument where it's sober and humble and it says, hey, we're just going to go with the facts and interpret the facts, but rather polemical is where you're using tactics like ad hominem and conjecture and things like that. Does it make? So ulterior motives. It's not disinterested inquiry, like neutral stuff. It's you've got an agenda. You're trying to.
So are we in polemic times?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you'll like this, but I really do believe this. It's easy to illustrate. I don't know if it's easy, but you can illustrate people like Ehrman and others who are using scholarship for polemical purposes, to be sure. Everybody's guilty of it. We typically call that sort of approach to things as confirmation bias. Everybody's guilty of confirmation bias. I think the task of the critical thinker is to avoid that as much as possible. Anybody who's not open to their work or their ideas or their theories being falsified is ultimately ideological and just simply doing confirmation bias. So Lutherans are exempt from that in that we acknowledge that God can. In practice it's a different story, but our theology says that no, it's Jesus, this guy who came into time and space, who's not just a guy but also fully God, and demonstrates that helps us avoid that ideological trap that says it's all true regardless of facts, if that makes sense. Yes, sir. And then we'll go from there.
The Jack Cassiano, who's the 3, 7, and 10 guy, does his methods add reliability to scriptures or not?
I don't know anything about him and that stuff of his
He's
work.
a guy that has,
Yeah, I know the reputation, but I don't
he
know anything
has
else.
a computer, and
Oh.
he has a huge number of the documents that you
Oh.
just mentioned. And
I
he
don't know.
finds the repeats of the 3, 5, and 7 are more than the average you'd find in the 8.
I
And
can't speak.
that they were hidden, and nobody realized that until they got a computer where they could search for that stuff. And he says, all these things come out now, that
Yeah.
it's a Hebraic
Yeah,
code
Yeah.
sort of in there.
I'll look into it. I just don't know. Since we're talking numbers, something for you to Google later on. You all know from Iron Maiden and the New Testament, Book of Revelation, that the number of the beast is 666, right?
Yeah.
There is a manuscript that has it as 616, just to upset you a bit.
But he puts a lot on the internet.
I try my best to stay away from the internet, so I'll look into it tonight. I'll stay up late pondering Jack Cashone's numerology. Sorry.
Go back, Tyler.
Is it just
Mary, did you have a question?
No,
Yeah.
I'm just raising my hand. Well, it's obvious that this airman fellow liked to make money, and that's probably why he did what he did in that book. Is that his last
Well,
book?
really good question and point
I
is,
mean, there's, maybe subconsciously almost.
yeah, I mean, I get, when I'm thinking about like how I'm 50, 15 years I'd like to retire if my wife will let me and stops bringing in kids to our house. And I think, oh my gosh, I need money. So I'm like, what could I do? Like I could do stuff with my hands, but what could I do to make a ton of money? I tried Bitcoin, it flopped. And it was only like $10. But I thought, if I came up with something I didn't really care about, but I knew enough about where I could put some new wild thing out there, I could do that. So I have to imagine there's always the temptation for teachers who don't make a ton of money. Even, I mean, the news will talk about it as if professors, full professors make tons of money. They don't. There's always that incentive. But he would say that he's doing scholarship, and he's got a record of doing pretty careful scholarship in the past. The way he's been, when he's interviewed about, like, why did you go from scholarly work to more popular publications? And he would say, I think the facts need to be known by people other than scholars. So it's like a type of altruism, if you will.
Doing it for the people.
Yeah. And I mean, I mention his name only because he's like the high-profile guy. If you were to go to university and take a course on early Christianity, minus probably a Concordia or like some sort of traditional Christian college, they would be using Bart Ehrman's work. He's widely read. And he's a great author in terms of ability to communicate ideas in a way that's, you're not like rereading a sentence 5 times to understand it. There's plenty of others who are doing it. I don't want to just pick on Bart
Well,
Ehrman.
you mentioned a woman, and I already forgot her name. You said she taught cards.
Elaine Pagels,
Yeah, what does she teach?
Christianity. She taught at Harvard
doesn't believe it.
Harvard Seminary, Harvard Divinity School, yeah.
Figures, yeah.
In the world
Work there.
of higher ed and theology, it's a weird world. We'd like it for it to be classic and orthodox. Thank God for places like the Concordias that will still hold the line. They really are outliers in the broader arena. So you can tell CJ I said that. Okay, thank God for him. Yeah. So those are just 3. Those are big ones. These are things that, not that this is a battle or anything like this, but these are things we cannot let go. It's not going to undermine our faith or anything like that, but in the public arena, if the claim that the Jesus of history is not the Jesus of faith is sort of becomes, as it kind of has, like the default assumption, then the Christian faith kind of smells like a cleverly devised myth, if it's clever. Or those people who say, the early Christians, all they were doing was like providing a more historical narrative to those old Greco-Roman and Egyptian mythologies. I mean, that stuff gains traction, and at least in the realm of apologetics, which again is not the only arena, but it's the one where I think we need the most work and preparation. It behooves us to at least be prepared to respond to those who might challenge us on this front, and it might even be at your own table. I told you I was going to tell you this story about my son, and we'll conclude with this, and we'll kind of conclude with this. My oldest son is a contrarian. I don't know where he gets it from. And always kind of a free-thinking, free-spirited kid. And his best friend growing up in Southern California, his mom was a hardcore atheist. She had a really rough experience with the guy, Eric's, her son's dad. He was awful, abusive, and all the other things. And she cited that as her, she was Catholic, Hispanic Catholic, and she cites that as her move away from not just Catholicism, but believing in God. Because if God existed and was all loving and all powerful, why would he let these horrible things happen to me? Well, never mind that you made certain decisions, dummy, but we didn't say that. You drank tequila with her and chatted, but anyway, she was an atheist, and she started becoming kind of like a polemical, and started beefing up her atheism, meaning she was reading the works of Richard Dawkins and others and would kind of recite some of those arguments. And anyway, my son picked up on them, and he likes to push buttons. He was probably 13-ish at the time, I guess, and I remember him announcing to us one day that he was an atheist. And I'm like kicking my wife under the table, don't overreact. And I was very proud at how chill she was. Like, I'm chill, but that stuff kind of freaks me out, but that stuff really freaks her out. And so we're like, oh, really? What? How'd you get there? And it was a little bit of a process, but that summer we went to Grand Canyon. And I remember Timmy the atheist is listening to the park ranger talk about how the Grand Canyon was formed. It was billions of years ago and so on and so forth. And Tim's there snickering in the corner. And I asked him later on, like, what were you laughing at? Not loud, he wasn't disrespectful or anything, but he's got a big, you-know-what-eating grin on his face. And why'd you think that was so funny? He goes, come on, Dad, everybody knows the Earth isn't that old. I'm like, so you're like a young Earth atheist? Or? And over time, you're like, we'd be having like a nice dinner, tri-tip or whatever, and I'd be like, look, Tim, doesn't it look wonderful? Your mom prepared all this stuff, but she didn't really prepare it, just popped into existence from nowhere, and we made little jokes, and apologetic jokes, I guess, and I mean, he eventually grew out of that, but as they oftentimes do, but we would use apologetics at the table, very lighthearted, friendly, it's obviously, it's family and so on, but increasingly it's within the family. I'm not going to get into any sort of details, but the further you get away from my nuclear family, it gets deeper and deeper into a world of crazy and criticism of Christianity. Trans craziness, and then like anti-Christianity and things of that nature. Apologetics is not always the appropriate response, but sometimes it is. All the other things don't take a whole, it might take a little bit of practice, but you don't need to read a whole lot to learn how to be nice.
Some people.
Yeah, I mean, do you speak from experience?
I need a little more.
Yeah, but apologetics does take a little bit of reflection and paying attention to the details, like the footnotes in your Lutheran study Bible, for example. And a little broader thinking than what maybe we're used to in the church, because we've not had to face all these things so much in the past, so we don't have a whole repertoire of these things. We're really good at confessing the Christian faith and its purity. We're really good at worshiping in light of the great historic Christian tradition and those sorts of things, but we don't have a whole lot of experience of squaring off with that verse. I shouldn't put it that way. That's a little too militant. But answering those who would ask us for a reason for the whole premise. So.
I was gonna say, just a quick comment, even Jesus had trouble with his own relatives. According to the Bible,
You know,
prophets,
his children?
prophets aren't any good in their own hometown.
Yeah.
So how can we hope to have much of a, all we can do is try. We
Yeah.
can't, you know, he had a tough time, we're gonna have a tough time.
Let's close with that, with Jesus' words, that we are, like him, we are not of this world, but he did not ask the Father to take us out of this world, but rather to protect us from the evil one and to be salt and light in this world. And to jump from Jesus to Luther, I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but Luther, like Luther says, we are not promised a bed of roses or anything like that. In fact, if you want to wear the colors of the Christian court, you got to be prepared to suffer. And Anfechtung, as Luther called it. Anxiety is not the best way to translate it, but temptations and spiritual assaults and persecution are all wrapped up in that term, Anfechtung. Luther says that is a normal thing in the Christian life, is Anfechtung. And for him, the best way to deal with Anfechtung is to remember that Jesus came into time and place, that he lived and dwelled among the first century people of the Holy Land, died on a cross for our sins, but not only for our sins, the sins of the whole world, and rose for our justification. And that's the beginning and the end of the Christian faith in many ways. There's more to it, obviously, but that's for Luther, the heart and soul, and the one thing to never forget. Not that any of you would forget it, but I think the world needs to hear it more and more in creative and winsome ways. That's enough. It's 4 o'clock, a little after 4. I don't know, there's no time for Q&A, but I think I'm kind of stuck here. I'm stuck here only because I heard there's beer in about an hour. So. I'm happy to chat.
I bet you the beer's already here.
Well, it's going to be even greater, but it's been great. Thanks for the invite out to California. As much as I make fun of California, just kidding. As much as I
It deserves
make
it.
fun of California's politics, I love California.
We're just too
And,
easy.
Yeah. So, it's good to be here.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Francisco. It is great to have you here, and thank each one of you for coming and spending this day with us. And it's not done. You're welcome to stay till we kick you out. We have games and food being prepared over there. Since today's the Feast of Holy Cross, and that's